The galaxy had been burning for 300 years and nobody could stop it, because the ones doing the burning were too strong and too cruel to be stopped by anyone who tried. The Krell Empire stretched across 40 star systems, and every single one of those systems had been taken by force and blood and the screams of those who thought they could resist. The Krell were hunters, and they were very good at what they did, because hunting was not just their job or their military strategy, but their entire way of life and their religion and their culture, all wrapped into one terrifying package that descended on worlds like a nightmare made. Real Commander Jake Harrison had seen the recordings from the first contact, and he wished every day that he could unsee them, because the images haunted him during every quiet moment when his mind was not occupied with keeping his crew alive. The Krell stood nearly 8 feet tall, with scales that could deflect small arms fire and claws that could tear through steel plating like it was paper, and teeth that were designed by evolution or cruel fate to rend flesh from bone with maximum efficiency. But their physical advantages were not what made them so dangerous, because the galaxy had plenty of strong species and plenty of species with natural weapons. What made the Krell truly terrifying was that they enjoyed it, and they had built their entire civilization around the concept that the strong had not just the right but the sacred duty to hunt the weak. The bridge of the Earth. Defense ship Valiant hummed with the quiet efficiency of a crew that had learned to work in near silence, because unnecessary noise could mean the difference between detection and survival. Jake stood at the command station watching the main display, where another red icon had just winked out of existence, and he knew without needing confirmation that another human colony had gone dark. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez worked at her station with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing that one mistake could doom thousands of people, and she had not made a mistake yet, but the weight of that responsibility was visible in the tension of her shoulders. The communication came through on the emergency channel, and Amy's hands moved across her console, bringing up the message, even though everyone on the bridge already knew what it would say, because they had heard the same message 17 times in the last month. The colony on Epsilon Prime had detected Krell ships in orbit, and they were requesting immediate assistance, and they were sending this message knowing that help would not arrive in time, but sending it anyway, because dying with hope was better than dying in despair. Jake listened to the message play out, and he listened to the screams that came in the last few seconds before the transmission cut off, and he added another name to the list of places that humanity had failed to protect for 2 years. Earth had been trying a strategy that went against every instinct that humans possessed, because the strategy was to hide and to run and to avoid contact with the Krell at all costs. The various governments and military commands had made the calculation that humanity was not ready for a direct confrontation, and that the only way to survive was to stay small and quiet and hope that the Krell would lose interest and move on to hunt other prey. Some colonies had been evacuated back to Earth and the inner systems, while others had been ordered to maintain communications blackout and to hide any signs of technological development that might attract Krell attention. It was a strategy born of desperation and fear, and the certain knowledge that in a straight fight humanity would lose. Jake had argued against this strategy in every meeting and every report and every conversation with his superiors, because he believed that running and hiding only delayed the inevitable, and that the Krell would eventually find every human colony no matter how well they hid. He had studied the Krell tactics and their history and their psychology as much as anyone could study a species that considered all other life forms to be either prey or obstacles. The Krell had a sense for weakness, and they could smell fear across light years, and the more humanity ran, the more attractive they became as targets, because predators always wanted the hunt to be challenging, but not too challenging. The door to the bridge slid open, and Captain Linda Hayes entered with the kind of expression that told Jake something significant had changed before she even spoke. Linda had been in command of deep space operations for the last year, and she had access to information and strategic decisions that even Jake was not always privy to, despite his rank and position. She walked directly to the command station and gestured for Jake to follow her to the tactical room, where they could speak without the entire bridge crew listening in on a conversation that might contain information too sensitive or too disturbing for general distribution. The tactical room was small and cramped, with displays covering every wall, showing ship positions and resource allocations and threat assessments that painted a picture of humanity barely holding on against an enemy that had not even committed its full strength yet. Linda stood in the center of the room and took a breath before speaking, and Jake could see that whatever she was about to say had been weighing on her heavily. She told him that she had just finished a secure communication with Fleet Admiral Cooper, who was the highest-ranking military officer in the Earth Defense Forces, and that the Admiral had been in contact with the civilian government leadership, and that a decision had been made at the very highest levels. Humanity was done hiding and done running and done watching colonies die while Earth sat back and hoped that the storm would pass them by. The decision had been made to go on the offensive and to take the fight directly to the Krell and to show them that humans were not prey, animals waiting to be hunted, but were themselves capable of being hunters when pushed far enough. Linda explained that every major shipyard had been working in secret for the last 18 months on new weapons and new ships and new tactics specifically designed to counter Krell advantages. The scientists and engineers had been studying every piece of Krell technology that had been recovered from destroyed ships and every tactical recording from every encounter and every piece of intelligence that humanity had been able to gather through observation and espionage. Jake felt something shift inside him as he listened to Linda lay out the broad strokes of the plan, because this was what he had been advocating for since the beginning, and now it was finally happening. But the reality of it was more frightening than he had anticipated. Going on the offensive meant accepting casualties and accepting that some battles would be lost, and accepting that humanity might lose everything if the plan failed. But it also meant fighting back and striking at an enemy that had grown complacent and arrogant from 3 centuries of unchallenged dominance. The Krell had hunted so many species into extinction or submission that they had forgotten what it felt like to be challenged by prey that could adapt and learn and strike back. The Valiant received new orders within the hour, and those orders were simple and direct in a way that military orders rarely were, because the time for complexity and caution had passed. They were to proceed to the Krell staging area in the Arcturus sector, where intelligence indicated a major hunting fleet was preparing to move against human colonies in the Outer Rim. They were not to observe, and they were not to report back, and they were not to avoid contact, but instead they were to engage and destroy, and send a message that would echo across the galaxy. Jake stood on the bridge as the Valiant moved out of its hiding position and began the journey toward what would either be humanity's greatest victory or its final defeat, and he wondered if the Krell had any idea what was coming for them. The Krell warship hung in the darkness above the human colony like a monument to death itself, and War Master Thrak stood in the command center studying the holographic display of the settlement below with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted hundreds of such hunts before. 12,000 humans lived in this colony called New Haven, and they had no military defenses worth mentioning, and no escape routes that his ships had not already blocked, and no hope whatsoever of survival unless they surrendered immediately and accepted their fate as either slaves or trophies. Thrak felt the familiar anticipation building in his chest, because this was what he lived for and what every Krell lived for, which was the moment before the hunt, when the prey was still unaware, and still going about their pathetic lives not knowing that death was already circling overhead. The settlement had been established only 3 years ago according to the intelligence reports, and it was primarily agricultural, with some light manufacturing, and a small spaceport that serviced cargo vessels bringing supplies from Earth and taking away crops to feed the inner colonies. The humans had tried to hide it by keeping their electromagnetic emissions low, and by camouflaging their structures to blend with the natural landscape. But the Krell had sensors that could detect the chemical signatures of human habitation from orbit, and besides, the Krell had informants scattered throughout the galaxy who sold information about prey species for credits or for the promise of being spared when their own worlds were eventually targeted. Thrak had paid very little for the coordinates of New Haven, because human colonies were becoming common knowledge among the information brokers who made their living off of species too weak to protect themselves. Thrak ordered his second in command to prepare the hunting parties and to make sure that the warriors understood that he wanted live captures, because dead prey had no value in the arenas back on the Krell home world, where the greatest warriors proved their skill against captured aliens. The humans would provide excellent sport because they were intelligent enough to be creative in their attempts to escape, but not strong enough to actually pose a threat, and that combination made them perfect for the games that the Krell nobility paid vast sums to witness. 3 dropships began their descent toward the colony surface, carrying 200 Krell warriors equipped with net launchers and stun weapons, and all the tools needed to capture prey without killing it immediately. But something happened that Threk had not anticipated and that no Krell commander had experienced in living memory, because the moment the dropships entered the lower atmosphere, the colony's defense grid came alive with power readings that were impossible according to everything the Krell knew about human military capability. Railgun emplacements that had been hidden under camouflage netting suddenly revealed themselves and opened fire with a rate of accuracy that suggested targeting computers far more advanced than what humans were supposed to possess. The projectiles moved at hypersonic speeds and struck the dropships with enough kinetic force to punch through shields that had withstood plasma weapons from a dozen other species, and 2 of the 3 ships exploded in fireballs that lit up the night sky over New Haven. Threk roared orders at his crew, demanding evasive maneuvers and demanding explanations for how prey animals had somehow acquired weapons that could threaten Krell ships. But the answers did not come fast enough and would not have mattered anyway because the ambush had only just begun. Hidden missile silos opened across the colony's perimeter and launched projectiles that moved with the kind of speed and maneuverability that suggested human engineers had been studying Krell technology and had found ways to counter it. The missiles were not like anything in the databases, and their warheads were designed specifically to exploit weaknesses in Krell armor that should not have been known to any species outside the Krell Empire itself. Thrak's flagship shuddered under multiple impacts and warning alarms screamed across the command center as hull breaches were reported on 3 decks, and the shield generators began to overload from absorbing more damage than they were designed to handle. The War Master felt something he had not felt since he was a young warrior in training. And that feeling was fear because suddenly, he was not the hunter, but the hunted, and the prey he had come to capture was revealing teeth and claws he did not know they possessed. His tactical officer reported multiple human vessels emerging from stealth positions around the planet, and Thrak realized with growing horror that New Haven had not been a defenseless colony, but a trap baited specifically for Krell hunting fleets. The Earth defense ship Valiant dropped its stealth field and appeared directly above Thrak's flagship, close enough that the Krell sensors screamed proximity warnings, and close enough that the main weapons batteries could target individual sections of the Krell ship with perfect precision. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant and felt a fierce satisfaction as he opened a communication channel to the Krell flagship, broadcasting on all frequencies and speaking in the Krell language, which he had spent 2 years learning specifically for this moment. He informed Thrak that the Krell vessels had entered human territory, and that they were surrounded and outgunned, and that they had exactly 1 minute to power down their weapons and surrender or be destroyed. Thrak responded with laughter that rumbled through the communication system like thunder, because even in the face of defeat he could not believe that prey animals were giving him orders and telling him to surrender. He broadcast back to the human ship reminding them that the Krell had been hunting for 1,000 generations, and that they were the apex predators of the galaxy, and that no prey species had ever defeated them in open combat. Jake listened to the Krell commander's boasts and felt no anger because he had expected exactly this response and had planned for it, and when he replied, his voice was calm and cold and certain. He told Thrak that the Krell had made a critical mistake in their assessment of humanity, because they had assumed that being physically weaker meant being inferior in all ways. He explained that humans had been studying the Krell for 2 years, learning their tactics and their technology and their psychology, and finding every weakness and every flaw in their seemingly perfect hunting machine. He told Thrak that the Krell were indeed apex predators, but that they had never encountered a species that could adapt as quickly as humans could, and that adaptation was humanity's true strength, and that the hunt was about to be reversed in a way that the Krell would never forget. The battle lasted less than an hour, and it was brutal in its efficiency because every weapon the humans fired and every tactic they employed had been designed specifically to counter Krell advantages. The Krell were stronger and tougher and more aggressive, but humans had better technology and better strategy, and the element of surprise that came from being underestimated. When the Krell tried to close to boarding range where their physical advantages would matter, the human ships maintained distance and used long-range weapons that the Krell shields could not adequately defend against. When the Krell tried to overwhelm human defenses with numbers the humans used, coordinated fire patterns that destroyed ships faster than the Krell could regroup. Colonel Danny Price watched from the surface of New Haven as the Krell fleet was systematically dismantled in orbit above, and he felt grim satisfaction because this colony had volunteered to be bait, knowing that they might all die if the plan failed. Every person in New Haven had been issued weapons and given basic military training, and the entire settlement had been turned into a fortress disguised as a defenseless agricultural outpost. The colonists had lived for 6 months knowing that Krell ships might arrive at any moment and knowing that their job was to look weak and helpless, while secretly being ready to unleash weapons that would shock any attacking force. When the last Krell ship was disabled and drifting, Jake ordered boarding parties to secure the vessels and take prisoners, rather than destroying the ships outright, because humanity needed intelligence and needed prisoners who could provide information about Krell military strength and deployment. The boarding action was tense because even wounded and defeated Krell warriors were dangerous, and the human Marines had to use overwhelming firepower to subdue defenders who refused to surrender until they were physically unable to continue fighting. Thrak himself was captured after his command center was breached, and he was found standing over his tactical station, still trying to coordinate a defense even though his ship was completely disabled. They brought Thrak aboard the Valiant in chains that were specifically designed to restrain Krell physiology, and Jake went down to the holding area to see the War Master face to face because he wanted to look into the eyes of the enemy that had terrorized humanity for 2 years. Thrak was even larger in person than he had appeared on the view screen, and his scales were scarred from decades of combat, and his eyes held a fierce intelligence that reminded Jake that the Krell were not simple beasts, but were a sophisticated civilization that had chosen violence as their path. The two commanders stood facing each other across the energy barrier of the holding cell, and neither spoke for a long moment. Finally, Thrak broke the silence and asked the question that was burning in his mind, "Why'd?" Lieutenant Chris Palmer flew his stealth fighter through the outer edge of the Sigma-7 system, with all weapons armed and all sensors running at maximum sensitivity, because he was hunting one of the most dangerous War Masters in the Krell fleet. And this was not the kind of target you approached casually. War Master Draken had been responsible for the destruction of at least 15 colonies, across 3 different species, and his reputation among the Krell was legendary, because he never let prey escape, and never showed mercy, even when his victims begged for it. The intelligence report said that Drakon kept trophies from every hunt, and that his personal chambers were decorated with the skulls and bones of thousands of sentient beings who had made the mistake of being weaker than he was. Chris had volunteered for this mission, even though everyone in the briefing room had understood that hunting Drakon was essentially suicide, because the War Master had survived over 100 battles and had never been defeated, and had killed 3 other species, champions in single combat. But humanity was not interested in single combat anymore, because they had learned that honor and fair play were concepts that got you killed when fighting an enemy who only respected strength. Chris had studied every recording of Drakon's tactics and every report from survivors who had encountered his hunting parties, and he had formed a picture of a commander who was brilliant and ruthless and utterly convinced of his own superiority. The Krell warship appeared on Chris's sensors exactly where the intelligence predicted it would be, because Drakon was preparing for another hunting expedition and was in orbit around a planet that was home to a species called the Valix, who had been hiding from the Krell for decades. The Valix were a peaceful aquatic people who had no military capability whatsoever, and who had survived this long only by living in deep underwater cities that the Krell had not yet discovered. But Drakon had somehow learned of their location and was preparing to send diving teams down to drag the Valix from their homes and either kill them or capture them for the arenas. Chris opened a communication channel to Commander Kate Morrison, who was in command of the carrier Nightfall, which was holding position on the edge of the system, ready to provide support if things went wrong. Kate's voice came through clear and calm as she confirmed that all systems were ready and that Chris was cleared to engage at his discretion. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly difficult in execution because Chris had to get close enough to the Krell warship to deliver a payload of specially designed missiles without being detected, and without giving Drakon enough time to raise shields or launch his own fighters. The stealth fighter was a masterpiece of human engineering, built with technology that had been developed specifically for hunting Krell commanders, because humanity had learned that cutting off the head of the snake was more effective than trying to fight every warrior in the Krell military. The hull was coated with materials that absorbed sensor waves instead of reflecting them, and the engines ran on a cold fusion system that produced almost no heat signature, and every weapon system had been designed to remain dormant until the moment of firing to avoid any electromagnetic emissions that might give away the fighter's position. Chris had trained for 6 months in this fighter, learning its capabilities and its limitations, and learning to trust systems that seemed impossible even to someone who had grown up with advanced technology. He approached Dracon's ship from the night side of the planet using the planet's magnetic field to mask his presence and moving so slowly that even his minimal engine signature would be lost in the background radiation of space. The Krell warship was massive compared to his fighter, and bristled with weapons that could vaporize him in seconds if they knew he was there. But the entire point of this mission was that they would not know until it was too late. Chris watched, his targeting computer paint solutions on 3 different weak points in the Krell ship's hull, and he armed all 6 of his missiles, and he waited for the perfect moment when Dracon's shields would cycle for a routine maintenance check that happened every 12 hours according to captured Krell technical manuals. The moment came, and Chris fired all 6 missiles in a spread pattern that would hit the 3 weak points simultaneously, and then he immediately broke away and engaged his afterburners, because there was no point in maintaining stealth once you had fired weapons that lit up every sensor in the system. The missiles were moving at incredible speed, and they were designed to penetrate Krell shields even if the shields were at full strength. But with the shields down, they cut through the hull like knives through paper. Explosions bloomed across the Krell warship's surface, and Chris watched on his rear sensors as secondary explosions began to tear the ship apart from the inside, as the missiles' specialized warheads found ammunition stores and fuel tanks and power conduits. Dracon's ship began to spin out of control as its maneuvering thrusters fired randomly, and Chris knew that the command center had been hit and that the crew was either dead or desperately trying to regain control of systems that were failing across the entire vessel. The warship entered the planet's atmosphere at the wrong angle, and without the ability to slow down or adjust course, and Chris followed at a safe distance, watching as the pride of the Krell fleet became a meteor streaking across the sky. The ship crashed in a desert region far from the Valix cities, and the impact created a crater that was visible from orbit and sent a mushroom cloud of sand and debris thousands of meters into the air. Chris circled overhead, transmitting location data to the human special forces teams that were already en route, because the mission was not complete until they confirmed that Dracon was dead or captured, and until they secured any intelligence that might be on the crashed ship. He watched as Krell warriors began to emerge from the wreckage, and he could see even from altitude that they were disoriented and injured, and that their legendary combat effectiveness was significantly diminished when they were the ones who had been ambushed. The Special Forces teams landed a kilometer away from the crash site and began to approach on foot using the terrain for cover, because even wounded Krell were dangerous. The team leader was a sergeant named Greg Stone who had survived 3 encounters with Krell hunting parties and who had volunteered for this assignment, because he wanted to see what Krell looked like when they were the prey instead of the predators. Greg and his team moved through the desert with the patience of experienced hunters who understood that rushing in would get you killed, and that the key to successful hunting was to let your prey exhaust themselves while you conserved your strength. They watched the Krell through high-powered optics, and they noted that the warriors kept looking over their shoulders and kept scanning the horizon as if they expected an attack from any direction at any moment. This was exactly what humanity wanted, because making the Krell afraid was more valuable than simply killing them. Greg had his team maintain position and maintain silence while the Krell stumbled around the crash site, trying to organize a defense and trying to treat their wounded, and trying to figure out what had hit them. Hours passed, and the Krell grew, more agitated and more desperate as they realized that no rescue was coming, and that they were stranded on a hostile world with an unknown enemy somewhere nearby. Some of the younger warriors began to panic, and Greg could see through his scope that they were arguing with their officers about what to do next. The psychological operation was working perfectly, because the Krell had spent centuries being the hunters, and they had no experience or training in what to do when you were the hunted. Their instincts told them to attack and to show aggression, but there was no target to attack, and showing aggression toward empty desert accomplished nothing except to waste energy. Greg received orders from Kate Morrison to maintain observation, but not to engage unless the Krell tried to leave the crash site, because the goal was to let them sit in fear for as long as possible before either capturing them or eliminating them. Across the galaxy, similar operations were taking place as human special forces teams hunted down Krell commanders and Krell outposts and Krell supply lines with a precision and efficiency that shocked even the other species who had been fighting the Krell for years. The humans had spent 2 years learning and preparing, and now they were applying those lessons with devastating effect. Krell hunting parties that had been terrorizing colonies suddenly found themselves walking into ambushes where every move they made had been anticipated and countered. Krell supply convoys disappeared without a trace as human submarines attacked from the darkness of space and vanished before the Krell could respond. The most disturbing reports from the Krell perspective were the ones that described human forces appearing and disappearing like ghosts because the Krell military doctrine had no answer for an enemy that refused to stand and fight in open battle. The humans would strike and vanish and strike again from a different direction, and the Krell warriors who survived these encounters reported feeling hunted in a way that they had never experienced before. Some Krell commanders began to refuse hunting missions because the risk had become too great, and because prey that fought back effectively was not worth the honor gained from defeating them. The Galactic Council Chamber was a massive structure built by a species that had gone extinct 3,000 years ago, and it had been maintained as neutral ground, where the surviving species of the galaxy could meet to discuss matters that affected everyone. Ambassador Peter Grant walked through the halls leading to the main chamber, and he could feel the eyes of dozens of different species watching him, because humanity had never been invited to address the full council before, and because everyone wanted to see what the species that had defeated the Krell would say. Peter had been a diplomat for 20 years, serving Earth in various capacities, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the weight of this moment, because the words he spoke today would determine whether humanity became a respected member of the galactic community, or whether the other species would see humans as just another threat to be contained. The chamber itself was designed to accommodate species of wildly different sizes and environmental needs, and Peter walked to the central platform, which rose from the floor and provided a speaking position where all the assembled delegates could see and hear him. The viewing galleries were filled with representatives from over 60 species, and Peter recognized some of them from intelligence briefings, while others were completely unknown to him because the galaxy was vast and humanity had only explored a tiny fraction of it. He took his position on the platform and waited for the chamber to fall silent before beginning his address. Peter started by acknowledging the council and thanking them for the opportunity to speak, because diplomacy required observing certain formalities even when everyone knew that humanity had earned this invitation through military victory, rather than through years of careful relationship building. He explained that he came before them to discuss the future of the Krell Empire and the new order that was emerging in the galaxy, because the defeat of the Krell had created a power vacuum and uncertainty about what would come next. He could see the delegates leaning forward in their seats because this was the question that had been on everyone's mind since news of humanity's victories had spread across the stars. Chancellor Vrex of the Talarian Union was the first to speak after Peter's opening remarks, and his question was direct and pointed because the Talarians had been fighting the Krell for generations and had lost billions of their people to Krell hunting parties. Vrex wanted to know whether humanity intended to simply replace the Krell as the galaxy's dominant military power, and whether other species should prepare to live under human rule instead of Krell rule. The question created a murmur of agreement throughout the chamber because this was the fear that kept many species awake at night, which was that defeating one tyrant only to install another was worse than useless. Peter had anticipated this question and had spent weeks preparing his response because he knew that the future of humanity's place in the galaxy depended on convincing these species that humans were different from the Krell in fundamental ways. He explained that humanity had not fought the Krell because they wanted to dominate the galaxy, or because they wanted to build an empire, but because they wanted to survive, and because they could not stand by while innocent species were hunted to extinction. He activated a holographic display that showed dozens of worlds that had been liberated from Krell control, and he pointed out that every single one of those worlds was now free to govern itself, and that humanity had offered protection and assistance, but not subjugation. The delegates watched the display, and Peter could see skepticism on many of their faces, because they had heard similar promises from other species in the past, and those promises had always proven hollow once the military situation changed. Representative Korth, who belonged to a species that had served the Krell for generations, spoke up, and his voice was bitter, as he pointed out that pretty words meant nothing when backed by overwhelming military force. Korth argued that every conqueror in history had claimed noble intentions, and that the pattern was always the same, which was that species gained power and then used that power to dominate others, because that was simply the nature of strength. Peter let Korth finish speaking before responding, because interrupting would have been seen as disrespectful and would have undermined his message about humanity being different. He acknowledged that Korth's concerns were valid, and that history provided many examples of power corrupting even the most well-intentioned species. But then he issued a challenge to the Council, which was to judge humanity by their actions rather than by their words, and to watch how humans wielded the power they had gained through their victories over the Krell. He pointed out that humanity had been in a position to conquer dozens of worlds over the last 6 months, and yet they had not done so, and that the Council should ask themselves why a species with such military capability would choose cooperation over domination. The discussion continued for hours as different delegates asked questions and raised concerns, and debated among themselves about what humanity's rise meant for the existing power structures in the galaxy. Peter answered every question as honestly as he could, while being careful not to reveal sensitive military information or strategic plans that might put human forces at risk. He explained that humanity believed in the concept of collective security, where strong species protected weak species, not because they gained something from it, but because it was the right thing to do. This concept was alien to many of the delegates, because the galaxy had operated on principles of might making right for so long that the idea of altruistic protection seemed naive at best and deceptive at worst. Meanwhile, in a detention facility orbiting Earth's moon, War Master Thrak sat in his cell watching news feeds from across the galaxy on a display that his guards had provided because keeping prisoners informed was considered humane treatment under human conventions. Thrak watched reports of Krell forces surrendering to human fleets, and reports of former subject species celebrating their freedom, and reports of the empire he had served collapsing in ways that seemed impossible just months ago. He tried to understand how everything had changed so quickly and how prey animals had become predators, capable of dismantling the greatest military power the galaxy had known in centuries. Jake Harrison came to visit Thrak regularly because he believed that understanding the enemy was important, even after the fighting was over, and because he was curious about whether the Krell could change or whether their nature was fixed. Jake entered the cell area and stood outside the energy barrier looking at Thrak, who looked back at him with eyes that held less rage than they had when he was first captured. Thrak asked the question that had been burning in his mind, which was why humans showed mercy to their enemies when Krell doctrine taught that defeated enemies should be executed or enslaved because allowing them to live was a sign of weakness. Jake thought about the question carefully before answering, because this was not just idle conversation, but was a fundamental difference in philosophy that explained why humans had won. He explained that humanity had learned through thousands of years of their own history that strength without restraint led to endless cycles of violence, and that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. He told Thrak that executing defeated enemies created martyrs and inspired resistance, while showing mercy demonstrated confidence and created the possibility of former enemies becoming allies. This concept was completely foreign to Krell thinking, because their entire culture was built on the idea that you either dominated or were dominated with no middle ground. Thrak was silent for a long time, processing what Jake had said and trying to reconcile it with everything he had been taught since he was a juvenile. He finally asked what would happen to him and to the other captured Krell, because if humans were not going to execute them and were not going to enslave them, then what purpose did their continued existence serve? Jake explained that the Krell would be given a choice, which was to cling to their old ways and spend the rest of their lives in detention, or to help build a new galaxy where species cooperated instead of preying on each other. He told Thrak that humanity needed guides who understood Krell culture and Krell thinking, and who could help negotiate with the remaining Krell forces and who could teach other Krell that there was an alternative to endless hunting. The idea of Krell helping to dismantle the Krell Empire was so contradictory to everything Thrak believed that at first he thought Jake was mocking him. But as Jake explained the plan in more detail, Thrak began to see that the humans were serious, and that they genuinely believed that even Krell could change if given reason and opportunity. Jake pointed out that Thrak himself had already changed whether he recognized it or not, because he was asking questions instead of making demands, and was considering possibilities instead of simply asserting Krell's superiority. These were not the behaviors of a war master who believed absolutely in the hunt, but were the behaviors of someone whose certainty had been shaken by defeat and exposure to different ideas. Back at the Galactic Council, Peter was wrapping up his address by making concrete proposals for how the galaxy could organize itself in the post-Krell era. He suggested the formation of a mutual defense treaty where any species that was attacked could. 5 years had passed since the day humanity emerged from hiding to challenge the Krell Empire, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that even the most optimistic observers had not predicted possible. Admiral Jake Harrison stood on the observation deck of Unity Station watching ships from 20 different species dock and depart in a constant flow of traffic that represented the new cooperative spirit that had taken root across the stars. Unity Station orbited at the intersection of 3 major trade routes and had been built jointly by multiple species using technology and resources contributed by everyone involved. The station was massive enough to house 50,000 residents and served as both a commercial hub and a symbol of what could be accomplished when species worked together instead of fighting each other. Jake had been promoted 3 times in 5 years, rising from commander to admiral, and taking on responsibilities that extended far beyond simple military command. He now oversaw the Terran Defense Fleet, which had grown from a desperate collection of ships trying to survive into a professional military force that other species looked to for leadership and protection. But more importantly, he had helped shape the doctrine and culture of that fleet to ensure that human military power was used to protect rather than to dominate, because the temptation to use strength for conquest was always present and required constant vigilance to resist. Captain Amy Rodriguez approached him at the observation window and stood beside him, looking out at the view of ships and stars and the planet below that had been chosen as neutral ground for the new Galactic Union headquarters. Amy commanded her own ship, now called the Defender, and it was part of a joint defense force that included vessels from multiple species, all working together under unified command structures that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. She commented that it was hard to believe how much had changed, and Jake agreed, but also noted that not everyone was happy about the changes, because transformation always created winners and losers, and those who lost power rarely accepted their new circumstances gracefully. There were still Krell who refused to accept that their empire was gone, and who retreated to isolated worlds where they tried to maintain the old ways and the old beliefs about strength and hunting and dominance. These holdouts occasionally raided nearby systems or attacked shipping lanes, but they were more nuisance than serious threat because the organized Krell military had been dismantled and scattered. Most Krell had been forced to confront the reality that their way of life was unsustainable, and that continuing to hunt other species would only lead to their own extinction. Some adapted quickly, while others adapted slowly and painfully, but the direction of change was clear even if the pace varied. Thrak had become one of the most important figures in the process of Krell integration into the new galactic order, and his journey from war master to peace advocate had been difficult and often painful to watch. Jake had worked closely with Thrak over the years and had seen the former warrior struggle with concepts that contradicted everything he had been taught, but also seen him gradually accept that strength could be used to protect rather than to prey upon others. Thrak now served as a liaison between the Krell and the Galactic Union, and he spent his time training Krell warriors in defensive combat and teaching them that protecting others was more honorable than hunting them. The transition had not been easy, and there had been many moments when it seemed like Thrak would reject the new path and return to his old beliefs. But something had changed in him during his years of captivity and interaction with humans, and that something was doubt about whether the Krell way was truly the only way or the best way. Once doubt entered the mind, it was hard to remove, and Thrak had been forced to question everything he believed when confronted with evidence that prey species could become strong, and that cooperation could achieve results that domination never could. His transformation was not complete, and probably never would be. But he had come far enough that other Krell listened to him and considered his words even when those words challenged fundamental aspects of Krell culture. General Danny Price sent a message to Jake reporting that another former Krell hunting ground had been successfully converted into a protected wildlife preserve where the native species could live without fear of being hunted. The preserve was managed by a team that included both humans and Krell working together, which would have been impossible to imagine 5 years ago when the two species were locked in deadly combat. Danny explained that the Krell volunteers were doing excellent work as rangers because their hunting instincts and their knowledge of predator behavior made them uniquely qualified to protect wildlife from poachers and from natural threats. This had been one of humanity's most controversial proposals, which was to put Krell in charge of protecting the species they had once hunted, but it was proving successful because it gave Krell warriors a sense of purpose and honor while channeling their aggressive instincts toward constructive ends. Admiral Linda Hayes joined the meeting via hologram, and she looked pleased as she reported that the Galactic Council had approved the Mutual Defense Treaty after months of negotiation and debate. The treaty meant that any member species that was attacked could call on the combined military forces of all signatories for protection, and that no species would have to face threats alone. Linda explained that the treaty included provisions for technology sharing, and for joint training exercises, and for establishing response protocols that would allow rapid deployment of forces to any threatened area. This represented a fundamental shift in how the galaxy approached security because traditionally, each species had been responsible for its own defense, and alliances had been temporary arrangements based on immediate threats rather than long-term commitments. Jake listened to the reports and felt a sense of satisfaction mixed with continued wariness, because building peace was an ongoing process that required constant attention and effort. The military strength that humanity had developed to fight, the Krell was now being used to enforce the peace and to ensure that no species could prey upon others the way the Krell had done. But Jake understood that military strength alone was not enough, and that lasting peace required addressing the underlying conditions that created conflict in the first place. This meant helping weak species develop their own defensive capabilities and creating economic systems that benefited everyone, and establishing cultural exchanges that built understanding between species that had historically been isolated from each other. Peter Grant had retired from his role as ambassador and had spent the last year writing a comprehensive history of the conflict with the Krell and the transformation that followed. He sent Jake a personal message sharing some of his thoughts about what humanity had accomplished and what it meant for the future. Peter wrote that humanity had not just defeated the Krell, but had shown the galaxy that there was a better way, and that strength did not have to be about domination. He argued that the strongest species was not the one that could kill the most, but was the one that could protect the most, and that humanity had proven this through their actions over 5 years of peace building. Jake read Peter's message and thought about the journey that had brought them to this point, starting from those desperate days when humanity was hiding and hoping to avoid Krell attention. The transformation had required courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to risk everything on the belief that fighting back was better than accepting slow extinction. Thousands of humans had died in the battles against the Krell, and many more had been wounded or traumatized by experiences that would haunt them forever. But their sacrifice had purchased something valuable, which was a galaxy where species could live without fear of being hunted and where cooperation was possible, because mutual defense made aggression too costly. The observation deck of Unity Station provided a perfect vantage point to see the results of those sacrifices, because every ship that docked represented trade and cultural exchange and cooperation between species that were building relationships instead of preparing for war. Jake watched a Krell transport ship dock at one of the station's berths, and he knew that 5 years ago, such a sight would have triggered immediate defensive responses and probably combat. Now it was routine, because the Krell on that transport were traders and diplomats and workers who had found ways to contribute to the new order, instead of fighting against it. Amy commented that some of the younger officers who had joined the fleet in the last few years had never experienced the war and did not fully understand why the defensive posture and the constant vigilance were necessary. Jake acknowledged that this was both good and concerning because it meant that peace was becoming normal, but also meant that the lessons learned through hard experience might be forgotten if they were not actively taught to each new generation. He made a note to ensure that military training included comprehensive history of the Krell War and the principles that guided humanity's response, because future leaders needed to understand not just how to fight, but why humanity fought and what they were protecting. The communication system chimed, and Jake received notification that representatives from 3 species that had previously been isolated were